Trump is claiming that he will be enforcing stricter voter ID restrictions on the midterm elections with or without Congress's approval. Now, Republicans are claiming that these measures are necessary because of widespread voter fraud and people who aren't US citizens illegally voting in elections. Time and time again, those conspiracy theories have been proven false. The real reason that Trump and Republicans want increased voter ID regulations is because it will prevent tons of Americans from voting. And they know just how unpopular Trump and the rest of his party is right now. Over the past year, you've probably heard something about the SAVE Act, new voter ID regulations that are now headed to the Senate. The SAVE Act makes it harder for Americans to vote. It requires new forms of identification and prohibits people from voting in ways that they used to. All of this is supposed to stop voter fraud, but time and time again, it's proven that there is no widespread voter fraud swaying American elections. The real reason why Republicans and Trump are so desperate to pass the SAVE Act or go around it, as Trump is now claiming, is because they know that if all Americans were able to vote, Trump would lose in a massive landslide. The Republican Party and Trump are more unpopular right now than they have been in a very long time. And rather than do the work to win back voters through policy, they're instead going to try to suppress the vote in their favor. So on Truth Social this weekend, Trump laid out his plans for stricter voter ID. He wrote, "The Democrats refuse to vote for voter ID or citizenship. The reason is very simple. They want to continue to cheat in elections. This was not what our founders desired. I have searched the depths of legal arguments not yet articulated or vetted on this subject and will be presenting an irrefutable one in the very near future. There will be voter ID for the midterm elections, whether approved by Congress or not. Also, the people of our country are insisting on citizenship and no mail in ballots, with exceptions for military, disability, illness, or travel. Thank you for your attention to this matter." Now, there are several things wrong with this statement. First of all, when Trump and Republicans claim that they want voter ID, you have to remember that voter ID already exists. You already have to prove that you are a US citizen before you are able to vote in this country. And there is no evidence that people are regularly flouting this. Trump claims time and time again that Democrats cheat on elections and that the 2020 election was stolen, but multiple lawsuits and independent investigations have concluded that none of this is rooted in reality. It's a total fantasy to make up for the fact that Trump is more unpopular now than he has been throughout his entire presidency thus far. And again, he's relying on the same racist rhetoric to accomplish all of this. His racist rhetoric fuels ICE's brutal occupation of US cities, which target cities that voted against Trump. Now, Trump is using the same rhetoric to suggest that people who aren't American are the ones voting and swaying elections. But none of this is true. Trump just can't stand the idea that the majority of Americans don't like him and don't want to see him be president, which is the reality. It's also a classic Trump maneuver to claim that he has some irrefutable evidence that he's right. He's just choosing not to share it at this moment. I don't think anyone believes that Trump is combing through legal arguments or that he could even understand a legal argument if he came across one. Trump went on to write on Truth Social, "We cannot let the Democrats get away with no voter ID any longer. Pause, period. Just a reminder, there is voter ID. It already exists and it already keeps elections safe and secure." But nonetheless, Trump writes, "These are horrible, disingenuous cheaters. They have all sorts of reasons why it shouldn't be passed and then boldly laugh in the back rooms after their ridiculous presentations. If it weren't such a serious matter, it would be considered a total joke. No voter ID is even crazier and more ridiculous than men playing in women's sports, open borders, or transgender for everyone. Republicans must put this at the top of every speech. It is a can't miss for reelection in the midterms and beyond. Even Democrat voters agree, 85%, that there should be voter ID. It's only the political leaders, crooked losers like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, that have no shame and explain why it's racist and every other thing that they can think of. This is an issue that must be fought and must be fought now. If we can't get it through Congress, there are legal reasons why this scam is not permitted. I will be presenting them shortly in the form of an executive order. I hope the Supreme Court realizes, as they painstakingly review the very simple topic of countries saving tariffs and all sorts of other things that are making our country rich, powerful, and safe again, that these corrupt and deranged Democrats, if they ever gain power, will not only be adding 2 states to our roster of 50, but will also pack the court with a total of 21 Supreme Court justices. He then goes on to continue rambling about how evil and bad for the country Democrats are and how amazing he individually is for the United States. The reality is, none of that is true. But it is frightening that he's suggesting using an executive order to bypass Congress and institute these repressive laws. And again, the reason why Trump and Republicans are in support of this is because they know how bad they are going to get crushed in the upcoming midterms. When Trump accuses Democrats of cheating and scamming and laughing about it in back rooms, it's proof that every accusation from him really is a confession, because Republicans and Trump are the ones who are trying to cheat their way out of a disastrous midterm election cycle. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, has condemned the SAVE Act already, and they explain a little bit about why it would be so harmful and prevent so many people from voting, as is their constitutional right. The Senior Policy Counsel for the ACLU's National Political Advocacy Department released a statement saying the following. He said, "The Save America Act is another thinly veiled attempt to interfere with our elections. There is no evidence of widespread voter fraud that justifies imposing burdensome show your papers requirements on every eligible voter. Laws like this have historically resulted in many eligible citizens being delayed or denied access to the ballot due to paperwork issues, database mismatches, or bureaucratic error. What we are seeing from elected officials, seizing sensitive voter data, calls to nationalize voting, using violent federal agent presence as a bargaining chip, none of this is normal, and we must protect our voices and our ability to hold these officials accountable. These attacks on the freedom to vote and local election administration are occurring while federal immigration agents continue to brutalize our communities, kidnap our neighbors, and violate constitutional protections that are foundational to our democracy, including the right to protest and freedom of the press. The Save America Act and similar efforts are attempts to distract from these federal abuses of power while silencing voters who seek to hold this administration accountable at the ballot box. We urge the Senate to reject this bill and all attempts to undermine our elections." Now, here are some of the problems with creating stricter voter ID laws. Remember, you already have to show your ID to be able to vote. What the SAVE Act would do would be to make it much harder to vote. For example, they would require passports or birth certificates just to register to vote or to update your voter registration information. So, for example, if you move apartments into a different neighborhood and you need to update your voter registration information, you would need a passport or your birth certificate in order to do so. But an estimated 21 million eligible voters don't have these documents. Passports are expensive and confusing and time consuming to get, and not everybody has access to their birth certificate. I know mine is back at my parents' house several states away. And while I do have a passport, I'm in a position of privilege to be able to get one. Additionally, the SAVE Act would create new requirements for women who got married and changed their name. They would have to show a chain of documentation proving that name change, which would be extra time consuming, expensive, and difficult. The ACLU says voters with low incomes, naturalized citizens, voters of color, rural voters, older voters, young voters, and transgender voters would all be disproportionately impacted by these restrictions due to things like financial constraints, mismatched paperwork, and other obstacles. The ACLU continues. Moreover, the Save America Act would force states to engage in faulty voter roll purges and turn over Americans' private, sensitive voter data to the US Department of Homeland Security, the same department that is in charge of ICE. Now, a previous version of this proposed federal law already went into effect in Kansas. It was a proof of citizenship law which required people to prove their citizenship to register to vote. And it blocked more than 30,000 eligible voters from being able to do so. So it was later struck down for violating the National Voter Registration Act and the US Constitution. We already know that laws like this one are unconstitutional and that they block eligible voters from their constitutional right to weigh in on elections. But that doesn't matter to the Trump administration. What they want to do is win. And it doesn't bother them at all if eligible American voters are unable to uphold their constitutional right to do so. In addition to this, the Trump administration and the Department of Homeland Security under Trump are very interested in gaining more access to this sensitive voter information, which is why they recently showed up to raid an election center in Fulton County, Georgia, in connection to, once again, the disproved 2020 election stealing conspiracy theories. The SAVE Act is also incredibly reminiscent of the Jim Crow era, where Black Americans were disenfranchised and it was made incredibly difficult for them to exercise their right to vote. Some people, including Chuck Schumer, are referring to the SAVE Act as Jim Crow 2.0. And the director of policy at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund released this statement saying, "The Save America Act is not about protecting our elections. It's about disguising voter suppression techniques aimed at disenfranchising Black voters as election security. It is disingenuous, it is discriminatory, and it is all based on a continuously disproven narrative of voter fraud, propagated by an administration concerned not with voter protections, but solely with the fear of letting people select their own leaders." And like Trump hinted at in his Truth Social post about this, they're also seeking to place restrictions on mail in voting. At the same time, they're increasing ICE presence in blue cities where people are overwhelmingly more likely to vote Democrat. So picture this. Election day comes for the midterms, and voters are terrified of being targeted by ICE agents who are stationed outside of their voting precincts. But it's also been made impossible for them to vote by mail. So their choice is to either risk being detained, brutalized, and deported, or to stay home and not vote at all. I fear this is the exact crisis that many voters of color will be facing come election day. And Senate Republicans are very eager to see this pass their chamber and become law. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, a Republican from South Dakota, is eager to, quote, put Senate Democrats to the test on voter ID legislation. He said the Senate will have a vote on the SAVE Act. And he also said, "We will make sure that everybody's on the record. And if they want to be against ensuring that only American citizens vote in our elections, they can defend that when they have to go out and campaign against Republicans this fall." So he's giving away the game here for Republicans in the near future. They're going to do two things. One, they're going to work to pass the SAVE Act to install these voting restrictions. And at the same time, they're going to embrace this rhetorical strategy of making it seem like Democrats want people who aren't American citizens to vote. Republicans are committed to this conspiracy theory that Democrats keep stealing elections, even though some of them have gone to jail over pushing these false narratives. But there is a bright side to this, which is that it's clear that Republicans are terrified of what awaits them in the midterm elections. They know that Americans are not happy with how Donald Trump's second term has gone thus far. None of the promises made for Americans have been kept, and instead, people have been tormented and disadvantaged by Trump's disastrous policies. Of course, you have ICE's violent occupations of US cities like Minneapolis, where American citizens have been shot and killed by ICE agents who seem to have immunity. And at the exact same time, issues like affordability have not been solved. In fact, prices for Americans are continuing to raise because of things like Trump's tariffs, which basically operate as a tax costing American households thousands of dollars. So, with all of this in mind, it's clear that things are not going to go well for Republicans in the midterms, and that is what scares them. So, that's why they're trying to push this last ditch effort to prevent Americans from being able to vote in the first place. And they're specifically targeting these populations that they're afraid of because they know that voters of color, they know that married women, they know that all of these different demographics are people who are likely to vote against them. So they're trying to take away their constitutional right to vote at all. This whole process is incredibly corrupt and undemocratic, and it's important for people to remember that, and for Democratic lawmakers and representatives to push that narrative to combat what Republicans are already revealing they're going to say and do. Americans deserve free and fair elections, and it's clear that Donald Trump isn't interested in that. He only wants what will benefit him and his party. But at the end of the day, if American voters get to decide their future, they're not going to be deciding on another unconstitutional Trump term.